Oh, is it on? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this year's summer school. Can you all hear me? How's that? Still too soft. Can you turn it on? How's that? Is it better? Slightly. They still can't hear me. I must just speak louder. Okay, can you hear me now? Maybe I must borrow you.
If they keep speaking,
Say it again?
they won't be able to hear you if they keep speaking.
Okay. Okay.
This is Gossie who's telling you.
I think we need some silence, then maybe you can hear me. Okay, welcome everyone once again. I would like to welcome once again Jean Moorcroft Wilson, who I think needs very little introduction to some of you, but I'm nevertheless going to say something about her. As some of you all know, she is an eminent literary biographer and a leading expert on First World War literature. She's the author of several biographies, amongst them Siegfried Sassoon, Edward Thomas, Charles Hamilton Surley, and Isaac Rosenberg. She lectures at Birbeck College, University of London. She's well known for her works on the war poets in particular, which include a 2-volume biography of, amongst others, Siegfried Sassoon, entitled The Making of a War Poet, Siegfried Sassoon, The Journey from the Trenches. And she also completed a biography of Isaac Rosenberg, that's in 2008, and she also edited a collection of his poems. As if that is not enough, she just completed last year, in 2015, a new biography of Edward Thomas, entitled Edward Thomas from Austerlitz to Arras. And it was published, and it was nominated the Times Book of the Year. As if that is not enough, she has also published 2 works on Virginia Woolf, one entitled Virginia Woolf Life in London, a biography of place, that's in 1988, and another one entitled Virginia Woolf's London in 2001. And she also wrote some biography, a kind of biography on Leonard Woolf, Pivot or Outsider of Bloomsbury. That is quite a prolific, I'm quite impressed and intimidated. So let us welcome, with no further ado, Jean Moorcroft Wilson. I forgot to mention, sorry, she's also been commissioned to write a biography of Robert Graves. So she's busy working on that.
I asked her to tell you that so that on Wednesday you won't be too critical. I'm working on it. But it is lovely to be back again. Every year I pray that Mehdi is going to let me come back again. So, I mean, what would I do without my week of sunshine and happy faces? I hope you're impressed with my discovery of a young Tolstoy. And of course, today we're going to talk about war and peace. And I have made this joke. I'm conscious of the fact that I made it on Saturday, but I love what Turgenev said about war and peace. You know, Tolstoy himself said it wasn't a novel. And Turgenev said, no, it isn't a novel, it's an elephant. My first choice, then, of poem, because you know I always insist on starting with a poem, you will probably know well, if you know anything about English history, was written in 1854 about a war which took place in Russia, specifically in the Crimea, half a century after the battle described so vividly in War and Peace, but one with which Tolstoy himself was close and had close connections. As we'll see, Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. Probably some of you don't even need me to read it, you could recite it. Hearing of this charge by a brigade of British cavalry against some entrenched batteries of Russian cavalry, in which 600 horsemen were wiped out. Quite a percentage, isn't it? 2/3 of them lost their lives through a stupid blunder. Tennyson immediately sat down and composed what he called his ballad on the event, the charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Hence, honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. And of course, it also illustrates the main point of this course, summed up so admirably in what the great British historian Liddell Hart wrote about history. A history based solely on formal documents is superficial. He was an eminent historian, and yet this was one of his firm beliefs, that literature, one of literature's many achievements, that it often makes history more real to the reader than an account of the bare facts themselves. Shelley, as you probably know, claimed that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. If so, then novelists are the prose equivalent. Tolstoy's War and Peace, for instance, has enabled generations of readers to enter imaginatively into the facts surrounding Napoleon's wars with Russia, and I'm sure you know a great deal more about this than I do. I hope you're not coming for a history course. You could probably teach me a great many things about it, but you know, and I've included some maps in my handout, which I hope you have, in which you see that first of all, Napoleon came into Austria and then right up to the borders of Russia in the 1805-1806 campaign, and then later on into Russia itself in the Battle of Borodino. And these are the 2 or 3 main battles around which the novel centres. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, and then in 1812, as I say, the Battle of Borodino. His occupation of Moscow and his humiliating retreat from it, a period which Tolstoy himself described as Russia's glorious period. In 1805, well, we won't go into historical details, but there had been an alliance formed, the Third Coalition, with Britain, Austria, and Sweden to overthrow the French Empire and stop Napoleon's takeover of Europe. And I'm afraid it wasn't terribly successful in 1805. He just kept taking over more and more places. Many Soviet soldiers given sections of War and Peace to read in their barracks during World War II, later claimed that they had been stirred more by his description of warfare than by the actual battle in which they were involved, which I think is quite an achievement. Yet Tolstoy, as you probably know, was not even born by the time Napoleon left Russia in 1812, left so humiliatingly. In fact, he was not born until 16 years later, in 1828, though he did, as I've already indicated, have some experience of war and of being a soldier by the time he came to write War and Peace from 1863 to 1869. It took quite a long time. How long did it take you to read it? Those of you who can claim to have read it. I read it twice this year, so I'm showing off here. There is a television adaptation of it on at the moment. Do you get it in Cape Town?
Not yet.
Not yet? Oh, you have something to look forward to. Tolstoy's birth in 1828 places him squarely at the center of Russian literary history, occurring as it does 2 years before the man known as the father of Russian literature, who is, of course, Alexander Pushkin, 1799 to 1837, died very young, before he completed his great masterpiece, Eugene Onegin, and died, Tolstoy that is, in 1910, six years after another later giant, Chekhov. So that he may be said to straddle the whole century, the greatest colossus of them all, in a century full of colossuses. He was the grandson of a Count Bolkonsky and his mother's father. You notice the similarity to Bolkonsky, do you? Which I'll point out later. Whose estate, Yasnaya Polyana, he inherited, and which is apparently the model for the Rostov estate in War and Peace, Otradno. The father was Count Nikolai Ilyich Tolstoy, who came from an ancient and highly esteemed, a very poor family, making Tolstoy an aristocrat on both sides. He was the fourth son and child, christened Lev, nicknamed Lev or Leo, of the marriage. His mother died 2 years after giving birth to him. Some of you will know some of this from having come to the Anna Karenina course. And in 1837, when he was 9, only 9, his father died, so that left him orphaned on both sides. And the 5 Tolstoy children, because a daughter had been born when the mother died in childbirth, the 5 Tolstoy children were sent to their father's sister, the pious Countess Alexandra Osten-Sakin. Not that really that matters very much. Then, when she died only 4 years later, in 1841, Tolstoy still only 13, they were sent to Kazan in the east of Russia. Now, this is interesting because their paternal grandfather had been a governor of that state, and they also went to university there. So this is Tolstoy as a young, rather sulky-looking student at the university. His brother had passed through the university, and he stayed here for 6 years and followed in his footsteps. He left Kazan University, where he'd first studied Oriental languages, then law, but he left without a degree, partly because he didn't work and partly because he contracted a venereal disease. He was rather too fond, like Pierre Bezukhov in the novel, of the ladies. But ultimately, he left because he came into his inheritance in April 1847. Like Pierre in War and Peace, he suddenly becomes well off. But also, like Pierre, he is unable to deal sensibly with his money. I imagine that Pierre may occasionally have been threatened with the same kind of venereal diseases. And like Pierre, he started to plan all sorts of reforms. This wonderful contrast between the idealistic side of Pierre and the fun-loving, the side that likes tying bears to policemen's backs, which actually I think Tolstoy did. Imagine the fun, if you were a young man, of seeing a bear tied to a policeman's back. The bear is swimming and the policeman's looking rather helpless. But he quickly became bored with living in the country at Yasnaya Polyana. I'll show you a picture in a minute. And left first for Moscow, then for Petersburg. And you know that they're fairly close together and that Petersburg was the more fashionable center, but that Moscow was where the solid Russian families lived, usually having houses in both places. Mirroring in his movement between the two places also Pierre's movements between the two and his country house. His lifestyle again carried on with the gambling and the drinking. By 1851, and still restless, Tolstoy had left for the Caucasus, that's in the south, I believe, to join Nikolai in the army there. He looks even worse in this one, doesn't he? Doesn't look I prefer him in his peasant blouse, which you'll see in a moment. And it was here that he began to write. And you see, it's very important that you should register the fact that he has got experience of the army when he writes. And I think you can see that in the novel, can't you? You can see the way in which he talks about army life and the way the soldiers talk to each other and the camaraderie between them and the nastiness that sometimes develops and the ambitiousness of people like Boris and his mother who want to get him on in the service. It's all coming from a sort of first-hand experience of Tolstoy himself. He joined, therefore, a very fierce regiment, the artillery, the 2nd Artillery Regiment, and would expand his knowledge of war during this period. By 1855, the war in Crimea was over, and Tolstoy had realized, as he wrote, "My career is literature, to write and write." That's all he wanted to do. He'd been a soldier, he'd actually seen action. He'd seen what war was like, and I think it turned him into a lifelong pacifist, and he came back home determined to reform his estate and to help his peasants and to educate his peasants. He was a totally impossible man, but he had very high ideals. By 1856, too, he was told of the harrowing death of one of his 3 brothers, Dmitri, in the arms of a prostitute, and in 1860 witnessed the death of his other brother, Nikolai, which made, he wrote, the strongest impression of his life. And there are several deaths, aren't there, in the novel, which are described in very harrowing detail. Both deaths, his father's, also contributed to his intense description of Prince Antony's lingering and painful end. Hopefully, you have read the book and I haven't spoilt the plot for you. Happier times followed. In 1862, he married Sophia, or Sonia Bears. They would have, listen ladies, they would have 13 children. I thought 5 was a lot. 8 of whom survived. So that was a pretty good average in the day, more than half. And to begin with, at least, he was deliriously happy with Sonia, or Sophia, rather, and she with him. She was also the main reason that we have War and Peace in its present form, because she was a wonderful secretary, and whereas he would just throw away all his drafts, she insisted on keeping them. I think she saw, a very practical lady, she saw that they might be worth money in the future. She's also reputed to have copied out War and Peace 7 times by hand. I wrote Siegfried Sassoon 7 times, but that's only about 1,000 pages long. It is this marriage and his initial joy in it, which I think appears to have shaped the conclusion of War and Peace, in which all sorts of very happy and unlikely marriages take place between the 3 families involved. The 2 successful marriages between Pierre and Natasha, and Nikolai Rostov and Princess Maria. In addition, Tolstoy's own character and past experiences undoubtedly lie behind many of the male characters in the book. Pierre, Nikolai, Pierre's excessiveness, his dissolute lifestyle, but also, and this is something that you'll know about Tolstoy probably, he's seeking for truth. Always, despite his dissipation, wanting the truth about life. And of course, this also comes into Prince Andrei as he lies dying. What is life? What is life about? What are we here for? These are the questions that you might expect to encounter in a Tolstoy novel. Although Nikolai Rostov, another of the main characters, bears a recognizable likeness to Tolstoy's own father, he has also unmistakable resemblances to Tolstoy himself. The innocent side, as Nikolai thinks, the innocent side of Tolstoy's past, though it doesn't sound at all innocent to me. I think the innocent side is when he was only gambling and losing his estate. You know that he gambled his estate away, don't you? This very beautiful house was taken, this must be a replacement, I take it. The beautiful house was carried brick by brick away because he'd lost it in a gambling game. Amazing, quite amazing. Goodness knows he had to work very hard to get it back. And Nikolai's sister, Natashas, the main female character in the book, is clearly based on the beloved wife he's married the year before he starts War and Peace, Sophia Behrs. But only partly, since he also apparently was half in love with his wife's sister. Seems a familiar story, this, I think. Dickens, do you remember, fell in love with Mary Hogarth, who died sadly at the age of 17. A.N. Wilson, who is, I think, a brilliant biographer of Tolstoy, and if you want to start anywhere and you can't face War and Peace, start with Wilson and he may persuade you. So when I say Wilson, I don't mean this Wilson, I mean that Wilson, tells of an occasion in 1864 or 5 when Tsar Alexander II was coming to Tolstoy's local town of Tulsa, and they were invited, Tolstoy and his wife, to the ball, the big ball that was put on in the local town. Sophia, pregnant again and feeling unwell, told her husband to take her sister Tania instead. And Tania's excitement at this, her first ball, as well as Tolstoy's appreciation of her youthful vivacity and charm, Wilson believes, is reflected in his account of Natashas' joy at attending her first ball. Do you remember this? It's extract 4 on your sheet. I won't read all of it. So, if you look at extract 4, in the damp, chill air, in the closeness and half dark of the swaying vehicle, so she's on her way to the ball. She's cold, but she's excited, she's terrified, she's all those things. She vividly pictured to herself for the first time what was in store for her there at the ball. In those brilliantly lighted rooms, the music, the flowers, the dances, the emperor, all the dazzling young people of Petersburg, the prospect was so splendid that she could hardly believe it would come true. So out of keeping was it with the cold outside and the stuffy darkness of the carriage. She only realized all that was in front of her when she walked along the red baize at the entrance into the vestibule, took off her fur cloak, and together with Sonia, preceded her mother between the flowers, up the lighted staircase. Only then did she remember how she should behave herself at a ball, and tried to assume the dignified air she considered to be the proper thing for a girl on such an occasion. But fortunately for her, she felt her eyes growing misty. She could not see anything clearly. Her pulse was beating 100 to the minute, and the blood throbbed at her breast. It was impossible for her to put on the manner that would have made her ridiculous. And she moved on, almost swooning with excitement and trying with all her might to hide it. And it's a lovely description, isn't it, of somebody, some young person thinking, oh, now I ought not to be behaving like this. Natashas' father too bears a striking resemblance, apparently to Tolstoy's paternal grandfather, that's Count Tolstoy, the impoverished Count Tolstoy. He was actually called Tolstoy in the early drafts of War and Peace. That's interesting, isn't it? So the connection was quite explicit. Only later becoming Count Prostoy, that's the second name he was given, and only finally Count Rostov. He's certainly a lifelike mixture of good and bad qualities. His hospitality, his generosity, his kindness, which makes it impossible for him to reprove or check his servants, either his son or his servants, which of course eventually leads to the family's ruin because Nikolai spends all the money, loses all the money at gambling. It's all based with great affection and criticism, which I think probably the family felt for this grandfather, this feckless grandfather, and leads Tolstoy to base one of his favourite characters in the novel on him. Even more convincing, perhaps, because he behaves so outrageously that he could only be based on real life, is Bolkonsky, Count Bolkonsky. And I think that if you ever watch a film, you realise it's a gift for a character actor. It's done very well by Jim Broadbent in the most recent production. He is just totally impossible. He's drawn largely on Tolstoy's maternal grandfather, Count Bolkonsky. He's permanently irritable in the book, Bolkonsky, with his daughter, the pious, loving, highly religious Princess Maria. But beneath the irritability is a dependence on her, which actually makes him very, very vulnerable and very appealing at times. She's usually taken to be the model modelled on Tolstoy's mother, who of course was saintly because she died when he was 2, so he didn't actually know her. She's usually, therefore, imagined as an ideal for Tolstoy. Prince Bolkonsky loves his daughter so much that it leads to one of the funniest incidents in a quite funny novel, actually. It's very humorous in parts. She's being wooed by Anatol Kuragin, who is it Anatol or is it his son? Anatol Kuragin's coming to propose marriage to Princess Maria, and they're coming to the country house. But even before they arrive, the father is desperately unhappy at the thought of his daughter might leave him and marry this awful Anatol Kuragin. And when he sees that the servants have swept the snow from the drive to make the progress of Anatol and his son easier, he gets very, very cross indeed and orders them furiously to shovel it all back. "The road's covered up?" he asks. "Indeed, sir, thank God. Please forgive our singular stupidity." So this extra irritability, of course, without even saying it, shows us how desperate he is to keep his daughter. Jealousy, of course, is at the root of it. She fortunately can't stand Anatol Kuragin and is quite happy to turn him down. And in this he also resembles Tolstoy himself, apparently, who was insanely jealous about his wife. Tania Bears, remember the sister whom he's half in love with, Tania Bears in her memoirs records how both her brother-in-law, Tolstoy, and her sister, Sophia, quote, poisoned their lives with jealousy. You may have seen a film called The Last Station, in which you get the build-up to that, don't you? When Tolstoy is asked about the model for Bolkonsky and his son, particularly about the model for his son, Prince Andrei, who is the other main hero in the book, I thought what he answered was wonderful. He says, and I think it shows one something about the working methods of a man like Tolstoy, how you set about writing this huge novel, this vast fabric of life. He says Andrei Bolkonsky is nobody. He's very cross in case you think that he's sort of based him on anybody, because that would take away from his abilities as a novelist. Same as any character of a novelist, rather than of an author of biography or memoirs. I should be ashamed to publish if my work consisted in taking down portraits, finding out, remembering, in other words, I'm creating. Yet it's clear to me and to a lot of other critics that Andrei is based partly on Tolstoy's brother Nikolai, as well as on the father he lost. You know, the fact that he dies in the end and that he's really idealized to some extent. Tolstoy's own explanation for the creation of Andrei is intriguing and even more entertaining than Prince Bolkonsky. It's informative as well. It shows you how he goes about it. He says, in the Battle of Austerlitz, this is how Andrei came into being. He said, in the Battle of Austerlitz, that's the earlier one, 1805, he says, with which I began the novel, I needed a brilliant young man to be killed. You're supposed to laugh at that. I mean, I needed a brilliant young man to be killed. Later in the novel, I needed only the old Bolkonsky and his daughter. But since it is awkward to describe a character not connected with anything in the novel, I decided to make the brilliant young man a son of the old Bolkonsky. Then he caught my interest. A role appeared for him later in the novel, and I took mercy on him, only wounding him severely instead of killing him. I mean, that's very amusing, although, of course, it does have its serious side. Basically, the non-historical part of War and Peace, that's the peace rather than the war part of it, though both are intertwined, of course, revolves around these three families that I've mentioned. The Rostovs, Natasha and Nikolai Rostov, and their father, who is the feckless and kind prince. The Bolkonskys, with the daughter and Andrei, and the old bad-tempered prince, and the Bezukhovs consisting mainly of Pierre, who is the illegitimate son and who inherits the money, rather surprisingly, from his father when he dies. Nikolai Rostov eventually marrying, as I mentioned, Maria, and Natasha eventually, having fallen in love with Andrei and been unfaithful to him, finally is forgiven. But he dies conveniently, remember? He wasn't killed off then, but he was killed off later, and she marries Pierre. Pierre, the man who in the film always has little round glasses on at the beginning, and then as he gains in stature, takes off his little round glasses. The form or structure of the novel arises seemingly with complete naturalness from the way in which Tolstoy both compares and contrasts these three different families against each other and against the two very different states that are signalled in the title of War and Peace. But Tolstoy creates not simply a contrast between periods when the country's at war and between periods when it is not, because by this calculation, most of the scenes in War and Peace take place when the country is at war, but it's not like that when you read the book. But the book opening in 1805, the year of the Russians' first battle against Napoleon, and its main action finishing in 1812, you would imagine most of it would be around the war. But rather, the contrast in the novel is between the military and non-military scenes. So, you know, they can have a war raging, but at the same time, they can be having a ball or having a reception. In fact, that's how many of the scenes start. And these two states are held in balance. In the first volume, which is divided into three parts, and I won't go through the whole book, but the first part's exclusively peace, the second part is exclusively war, and the third part begins with peace and ends with war, just to show you that he likes to vary the thing, to bring the changes. Volume 2 covers the biggest span of years from 1806 to 12, and we don't have a huge amount going on at that time, and except that Natasha, who's 13 when the book opens, is grown up sufficiently to fall in love first with Andrei and then with Pierre. So it's all very convenient. Volumes 3 and 4 describe a continuous period of war. But the threads of war and peace are no longer parallel and separate, they're now closely interwoven, reflecting the fact that the conflict in the last part of the book is now on Russian soil, and this is the most intense part of the book. The Russians, who have never had any foreign armies on their soil, now have to suffer this indignity, and they cannot understand why their commander, Kutuzov, isn't chasing Napoleon out of Moscow. He knows full well that he would lose all his army if he did that, and waits and waits and waits until Moscow turns, sets fire to its buildings, and in a sense deals with Napoleon in their own way. And Napoleon has to leave Moscow. He's running out of food, he's running out of all sorts of provisions, and has to face that terrible trek back against Russia in the Russian winter. The Russian winter being, of course, the greatest ally that the Russians have. The integration of these two phases, war and peace, reflect the change in the nature of war then. And these two basic states of existence, apart from providing Tolstoy with the memorable title, itself, as you may know, borrowed from a French writer, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whom he met in 1857. He'd written a book called War and Peace, provide Tolstoy with a useful outer framework or skeleton within which he can examine more subtle questions, such as the effect on the lives of the main characters, as well as the effect on the Russian nation as a whole. It's a mistake to imagine that Tolstoy was interested only in the three main families. As his great near contemporary Turgenev wrote in 1880, a whole world arises in War and Peace, with a wealth of types taken from all levels of society. Though all levels of society seems an exaggeration to me, it is true that Tolstoy's characters include a wide variety of types, and I think one critic divided them fairly well when he talked about the broad outlines of these characters. He said some are incorrigible careerists, like Napoleon, or that chap I mentioned, Boris Drubetskoy, who's only interested in climbing up the ranks in the army, who, to quote Tolstoy, made friends, this is Boris saying this, made friends and sought acquaintances only with people who were above him and therefore could be of use to him. Those are Boris's thoughts. Terrible thought, isn't it, really? Other types of characters, like Hélène or Anatole Kuragin, Hélène is his daughter, think only of their own pleasure, including in the latest adaptation of the film Incest with Her Brother, which of course has had all the British press chattering. It's hinted at in the novel in any case, but she is a woman interested only in pleasure. And she captures Pierre because Pierre has money, and Pierre can't resist women, and she eventually marries him. They're superficial, but they are superb animals, which of course Pierre cannot resist, glorying in their senses and their appetites, with a complete lack of consideration for anybody else. I love Tolstoy's comment to the illustrator, an illustrator called Mr. Bashilov, about his sketch for Hélène. He looks at the sketch of Hélène and he says, "Couldn't you make her bustier?" Plastic beauty, he continues, plastic beauty of forms is her most characteristic trait. Nobody could say that about me, I'm afraid. Couldn't you make her bustier? I think that's lovely. Perhaps somebody could make me bustier, that's the thought. Yet others, such as Natasha and Nikolai, are quite different types again, fond of themselves and of the normal round of upper-class entertainment, until, in Natasha's case at least, they are made to suffer. And they are capable of learning. This is the third type of character, who has, I think, Tolstoy's approval. He can see that they're human, that they're failing, that they're selfish and self-centered to a large extent, but they are not utterly without hope, and they can learn. They're made to suffer, and they are not troubled by profound thoughts or difficult questions, but they are interested in other people. They are open, if you like, to the world. And then, finally, there are what we might call the Tolstoyan characters. Those who grope towards something bigger in life than simple satisfaction of self or self-interest, who struggle to overcome individualism, who recognize that in the cult of self, that the cult of self is inferior and ultimately less fulfilling than the service of one's neighbor or one's family, the community, or the country at large. These are the exceptions, and by no means without their own large faults. Prince Andrei and Pierre, for example, I would put in this category, but they have their fair share of self-centeredness and love of pleasure, as I think I've indicated in the case of Pierre. But crucially, they're not self-satisfied. This is a sign that he's a Tolstoyan character, if you look in the book. They're able to learn from their mistakes. They're capable of self-development. And also in Natasha's case, when Prince Andrei eventually realizes that his early goals of social success and fame, he's a very cynical character to start off with, but he develops, and I think that's another sign of a Tolstoyan character. They're capable of development. Pierre, who is initially tormented by doubts and who joins the Masons. Have we got any Masons? Oh, no, you wouldn't tell me if you were. I've always been interested in the Masons. But he joins the Masons not really for anything except to find out the truth about life. Do they have the key to truth? He wants to know about life. He's searching for something. He's rewarded at the end, of course, by his love of Natasha, which, after the convenient death of Prince Andrei, he is allowed to marry. I've got number 6 here. Why have I got number 6? Oh, yes, there he is. There's a Tolstoyan character for you. Of course, he fits the bill, doesn't he? I mean, he's an impossible character. He's very, very bad-tempered at times. He's very demanding at times, but he's also full of ideals. He wants to help. He wants to help in the fields. He believes in manual labor in the fields as a way of reaching life, and he also wants to help with education, and he starts a school in his village. That's Tolstoy later on meeting Chekhov just before Chekhov dies. Tolstoy's the bent one on the right, and this is Tolstoy just before he dies in 1908. He dies in 1910 in a railway station, running away from his wife. On a much smaller scale within the novel, there are other Tolstoyan characters. The peasant Karatev, whom he meets when he's imprisoned after one of the battles. Whatever their type, whatever we think of them morally or otherwise, his vivid portrayal of a vast array of characters, I think, is one of the great charms of the book. Makes it unforgettable and endlessly rereadable. So you see, there's no excuse if you haven't read it. You can read. You've got to read it, and if you have read it, you've got to read it again. So there's no But I do suspect that it is like Don Quixote. It's actually one of those books that is one of the greatest unread to the end classics. But he's very good at character. There's a character called Anna Pavlovna, but I can't say it, Pavlovna Scherer, and she's giving a little salon. And I think within about 6 lines, he sums her up beautifully. Prince Vasily, who's Prince Vasily Kurazhin, a very superficial man. Prince Vasily always spoke, this is extract 5, Prince Vasily always spoke languidly, like an actor repeating a stale part. Anna Pavlovna Scherer, on the contrary, despite her 40 years, God help us, despite her 40 years, overflowed with animation and impulsiveness. To be an enthusiast had become her social vocation, and sometimes, even when she did not feel like it, she became enthusiastic in order not to disappoint the expectations of those who knew her. The subdued smile, which, though it did not suit her faded features, always played around her lips, expressed, as in a spoiled child, a continued consciousness of her charming defect, which she neither wished nor could nor considered it necessary to correct. The society hostess, the professional society, shallow, insincere hostess. Tolstoy becomes each character in turn, even the female ones. His sister-in-law, Tania, said to him on one occasion after reading a section of War and Peace, "I can see how you are able to describe landowners, fathers, generals, soldiers, but how can you insinuate yourself into the heart of a girl in love?" She's thinking of Natasha. "How can you describe the sensation of a mother?" She is thinking perhaps of the Countess Rostov's terrible grief over the death of her younger son, Petya. "And for the life of me, I cannot understand how you can do this," she said. We'll see if you agree. I keep trying to make you read the book. No wonder Tolstoy's world often seems more real than our own, enlivened as it is by these absorbing and entirely convincing characters. Take, for instance, the Battle of Schöngraben, Austerlitz and Borodino. Though Tolstoy has researched all 3 in some detail, even visiting Borodino itself apparently in 1866, in order, he said, to write the best battle of Borodino yet. Even then, his reimagining of the events of 1805 and 1812 through the eyes of one or other of his characters is real because he's writing it, not because he's been to Borodino. In fact, when the facts don't fit his interpretation, he ignores them. Total disregard for the facts. I mean, the Battle of Borodino is normally seen as a triumph for Napoleon. In terms of the dead, and I can't actually tell you how many dead on each side, but certainly in terms of the dead, Borodino was a triumph for Napoleon. More French people survived and more Russians were killed that way round, but the way in which Tolstoy tells it, it becomes a triumph for the Russians, and that's how the Russians saw it, because of course in the end they would then have to leave Moscow and go home and lose a great many people. This is it's Adolphe Yvon. It's a French painter. It's not very well done actually because it's too small, but it's the retreat from Moscow when they suffered terrible deprivations, enormous number of dead. It was not the sort of victory, Tolstoy said, that is determined by captured pieces of cloth on sticks, known as standards, and by the amount of ground the troops stood and stand on, but a moral victory, the sort that convinces the adversary of the moral superiority of his enemy and of his own impotence that was gained by the Russians at the Battle of Borodino. This ability to bring the reality of a fight, of a battle, of a historical event, I think is illustrated time and time again throughout War and Peace. A passage towards the end of the first volume, where Nikolai Rostov at the First Battle of Austerlitz is allowed to take a message from one side of the battlefield to the other. And it's always stuck in my mind because it's a wonderful description of the confusion, the utter confusion of war. It's not as though he's telling us. He's actually showing you somebody going from one side to the other and thinking, well, what's it all about, you know? He's allowed to start on this ridiculous mission. Bagration knew, so he goes to Bagration and he says, I'm going to take a message for you. And Bagration knew, Tolstoy said, that as the distance between the two flanks of these was more than 6 miles, even if the messenger were not killed, which he very likely would be, and found the commander-in-chief, which would be difficult, he would not be able to get back before evening. So he sends him off in order to delay having to go into action because he thinks they're not going to win. Nikolai's excitement and relish in this, at best, meaningless exercise, at worst, fatal one, is vividly presented. And it's scenes like this, I think, which make this so convincing as a piece of history come alive. All his hopes, this is extract 6, were being fulfilled that morning. There was to be a general engagement, and he was to take part in it. He's a young, foolish man, and he thinks this is quite wonderful. More than that, he was in attendance on the bravest of generals. And still more, he was being sent with a message to Kutuzov, perhaps even to the sovereign himself. It was a fine morning. He had a good mount under him. His heart was full of joy and happiness. Having received his instructions, he gave his horse the rein and galloped off along the line. At first, he rode along the line of Bagration's troops, which had not yet advanced into action, but were standing motionless. Then he came out into the region occupied by Uvarov's cavalry, and here he noticed activity and signs of preparation for battle. Once past Uvarov's cavalry, he could clearly hear the sound of musketry and gunfire ahead of him. The firing grew louder and louder. The sound now reached him in the fresh morning air, was not of 2 or 3 musket shots at irregular interval, as before, followed by 1 or 2 cannon shots. It was a volley of musketry, interspersed with such frequent thunder from the cannon that sometimes there was no distinguishing them apart, and they merged into one general roar. He could see puffs of musketry smoke chasing one another down the hillsides, while smoke from the cannons rolled up in clouds, spread and became one. He could see from the glint of bayonets in the smoke, moving masses of infantry and narrow lines of artillery with green cuisson. Rostov stopped his horse on a hillock for a moment to try and make out what was going on. I think that's a very telling sentence, isn't it? He's there, he's in the middle of battle, and he's even more puzzled than we should be if we were standing back from it. It's a wonderful description, I think, of an event which all of us would experience probably in the same way. And so Tolstoy's attitude toward, though not officially pacifist at this point, is clearly questioning. It was probably what led the French critic E.M. de Vonnier to describe him as a queer combination of the brain of an English chemist with the soul of an Indian Buddhist. Tolstoy himself, in adolescence and young manhood, had been attracted, like Pierre, to French ideas, and this book had started with a description of a group called the Decemberists, who had risen against the Tsar and who were influenced by French ideas. But unfortunately, we've gone over our time, so I can't tell you all about that. But let me read you in conclusion. I mean, it's a book about many things, about love of various kinds, about war, about all sorts of fascinating subjects. But what I would like to read you in conclusion is what Dr. Konstantin Leontiev talked about when he talked about the greatness of war and peace. I love, he said, even adore war and peace. This is extract 11. For being a gigantic work and for its bold introduction into the novel of whole sections of philosophy and strategy. Hence Tolstoy's claim that this is not a novel. You don't think it is, he says. Contrary to rules of artistic restraint and accuracy that have governed us for so long. I love war and peace for the patriotic fervour that at times burns in its pages so fiercely, for the moving depictions of battle, for the powerful charm in the representation both of the temptations of the world and of the joys of family life, for the variety of characters who conquer the reader's mind, and for their endurance, for the character, and this is a man writing, for the character of Natasha. All men fall in love with Natasha, I've discovered, that gives life to everything and is so true and so attractive, for the wonderful poetry of all those dreams, deliriums, half-dreams, and states of mind preceding death. I love it, finally, for the reason that the best and highest of the heroes in the poem, Prince Andrei, is not a professor and not an orator, but an excellent, brave soldier and a hard idealist. I even bow to Count Tolstoy for that violence he did to me myself by forcing me to know, as if I were alive, and to love as if they were my close friends, people who seem to me to be almost contemporary, and by the will of the author are disguised in the clothes of Borodino, and transported only by the power of his genius half a century back into history. Thank you.